I'm going to read this because it's easier. The subject of my talk is debt and the problem of declining sovereignty of the nation-state. The relationship between debt and social organization, including both pre-capitalist and capitalist societies, is one of the themes of Deleuze and Guattari's book Anti-Oedipus. A later text written by Deleuze, called Postscript on the Societies of Control, expands on this theme. The basic premise of the later text builds on Foucault's idea of disciplined societies, where organization took the form of enclosure in institutionally organized social fields. Deleuze's concept of societies of control, on the other hand, signifies a form of organization in which these spaces of enclosure become abolished in their self-sufficiency and now stand in a relation of mutual openness. The element which leads to this change is capital in the form of debt relation. The distinction between disciplined societies on the one hand and societies of control on the other is not the subject of my talk. Instead, I wish to take the idea of debt as a mechanism of disorganizing existing social formations and opening them to the relation of capital to examine the functioning of the modern nation-state. One of the ideas which has its roots in Deleuze's idea of societies of control is Negri's and Hart's thesis that nation-states have lost the primary political function in capitalism, and that this function has been relegated to a decentered network of political power, which they call an empire. The idea follows partly from the distinction made above, namely that the transition from organization through confinement to one of control has the direction of abolishing isolated social spaces. If this direction is followed through, the abolition of these spaces would also encompass nation-states themselves as relatively isolated social units. As a result, the political capacity for organization would become displaced from a sovereign state into supranational formations, and the driving force of capital to negate existing social spaces and subvert them to its own logic would lead to dissolution of centralized political authority of the nation-state. The empire, which emerges from this, is not an extension of the sovereign nation-state, but builds an in itself distinct and relatively autonomous system in which the nation-state plays a partial and subordinated role. I wish to argue that this view is to a certain degree flawed, and that a state in the form of the modern nation-state still represents the central and necessary political form in which capitalist reproduction takes place. The argument does not contest the claim that with the internationalization of capital, a rising numbers of political actors, both within the state and beyond it, have displaced its sovereignty. Instead, it will show that this proliferation of political instances of control is predicated on the very connection between capital and the state. Debt, in this instance, plays an important role, which is at the same time and from the outset political and economic. I wish to begin with the central presupposition of the claim that nation-state sovereignty has declined, which is the relationship of the economic sphere of production on the one hand and the state on the other. One central feature of capitalism often brought up is that in opposition to other social systems, in it the political and economic spheres are differentiated. What is meant here is not that before capitalism these two instances were indistinguishable. Any society with a state already presupposes a distinction between the two spheres, but that the two, and more precisely the economic sphere, possess a level of self-sufficiency. The economic sphere, in other words, is not subjected to the reproduction of concentrated political power, and as such has a relative independence from the state. Now, this distinction between the economic sphere of production on the one hand, which functions according to its own logic, and the state on the other, is a subject on its own. The point here is that the thesis that capitalism is capable of transcending the state as its political limit presupposes that the economic sphere of production, freed from the centralization of political power in the state, is capable of becoming integrated with this power. In other words, the causal direction changes here. Instead of the state subjecting production to the goals of reproducing concentrated political power, in capitalism, this political capacity for organization emerges from within economic relations themselves. What is then presupposed here is that not only are economic sphere and the state external to each other, but that political capacity for organization does not proceed from the state. Instead, it is contained in the relation of capital, a relation of class conflict, from which then political constitution and organization of society emerges. Because the concentration of political capacity for organization in the form of a pre-capitalist state has been abolished, it becomes released and as such allows for the multiplication of political actors beyond the state itself. For example, within the civil society or on an international level. Furthermore, the release of this political capacity affects the state itself, insofar it forces it to transform according to the needs of economic reproduction. From this position then, which views political capacity for organization as not centralized in the state, but internal to the relation of capital, it is possible to think that through time, capitalist relations could dissolve state sovereignty and integrate the nation-state into a network of decentralized political power. In other words, the very logic of political power in capitalism and its relation to the economy allow for the eventual dissolution of any centralized form of this power. What I wish to argue, however, is that the question of state sovereignty does not fully overlap with the question of nation-state centrality, or in other words, its necessary and constitutive role in the capitalist economy. This necessary and constitutive role of the state does not contradict the fact that political capacity for organization is not exhausted in the state. On the contrary, it is the existence of the state which makes this political organization beyond the state possible. In other words, the necessary and constitutive role of the state is contained in it being an internal political limit of capitalist economy, as well as the condition of all other political forms which might appear in capitalism. To show this, I only wish to focus on one element of state power here, which concerns the possibility for the production of needs. The reason why I wish to focus on this element, and I will come back later to this, is that it is this proliferation of needs in a capitalist economy which is seen as the reason for the dissolution of state sovereignty. Now, as stated, one of the presuppositions of the thesis that nation-state sovereignty has declined is that political capacity for organization in capitalism is not concentrated in the state, but instead is present in the relation of capital itself. Organization does not proceed from a centralized state, but from class conflict, which realizes itself in a state. Central for this class relation, which follows the logic of production of surplus value to exploitation, is so-called economic compulsion, a form of compulsion which does not rely on overt political violence of the state. Instead, the state secures the establishment and application of the law, under which capitalist relation will be reproduced. However, if political capacity to organize emerges from the relation of capital itself, then this establishment and application of the law secures something more than the perpetuation of the state. In other words, the law does not affirm some external political power. It is not in service of this power, but in service of perpetuation of capital. For example, the law does not secure the reproduction of the person of the king, but of the person presupposed by the relation of capital. This can be seen in the very form of this law, namely that of private property. The method, however, through which this person is reproduced is not merely the subjection to the state, but the expulsion from specific, pre-established and inherited needs. The abstraction of personality, which is contained in this law, does not exist within a framework of needs that would, after the fact, become subjected to the state. Instead, any external element, such as culture, tradition, and so on, which could serve as the primary source of needs, becomes abolished in its primary function. The abstract person of capital needs only on the basis of the principle of private property. For example, to function in a capitalist economy, a human being does not need on the basis of beliefs, habits, skills, and so on, which are found in a division of labor conditioned by rules preserved through cultural and traditional ways of life. Instead, a human being needs on the basis of an abstract form of personality, which expresses the principle of private property as the capacity to internalize and engender needs as such. In other words, the abstraction of person, presupposed by capital, does not possess a set of given and inherited needs relating to specific object of production, but it has in abstract only the capacity to possess needs, i.e. capacity to function as a person of property, without this personality becoming bound to any pre-given framework of production. This capacity to produce needs is predicated on the form of law of private property that, as Marx argued, latently contains in itself labor power. One of the important roles of the pre-capitalist state was to protect the bondage of labor power to specific and established objects of production, to preserve both itself and the economic sphere from derailing into permanent conflict. In other words, by appropriating the surplus, the state constituted itself, but it also protected the productive sphere from the effects of this surplus. The modern state, through the form of private property, on the other hand, in abstract labor, releases labor power from these pre-established objectivities. It concerns itself with the form in which labor power will produce, whereas the reproduction of needs takes secondary place and is conditioned by private property as this form. This capacity to produce needs, however, I wish to argue, is what in turn makes the state the central political form of capitalism. The reason for this is that this realization of abstract personality, as mentioned, is predicated not on external political coercion of the state, but on economic compulsion. There is a difference between the two. For example, you do not feel compelled out of fear of the state, but out of anxiety and the inability to satisfy your needs. However, these two also share something in common. In the same way that fear signified a kind of externality of the despot in relation to the social formation he regulated, in other words, an excess which emerged from the fact that there was a non-coincidence between the life and the state. You require fear at a certain point to bind someone to a specific form of subjection, so that these inner feelings of compulsion signify the impossibility of a full integration into the capitalist system of labor organization. The reason for this is that economic compulsion is predicated on satisfying not only specific needs, but the form in which these needs are satisfied in capitalism, i.e. the abstraction of personality imposed by the law. In other words, you satisfy your needs through a specific form of consumption. This abstraction of personality, however, no matter how well interiorized, is not totalizing. When you fail to achieve something as an individual responsible subject, it is also the principle of individual responsible subjectivity that fails. It reveals the split between economic relations as such and the excess of political violence which make these a relation of capital. Fear, in other words, points to the surplus of political violence present in economic relations. This violence, which at first sight disappears in capital and gives way to economic compulsion, disappears only because it becomes internal to economy and begins to constitute this compulsion as such by imposing the principle of abstract personality. To put this in other terms, there is a continuity between the pre-capitalist or despotic state and the capitalist state. Both are necessitated by the unequal and hierarchical form of organization they sustain. Although political coercion and economic compulsion differ, there is continuity between them. Insofar, economic compulsion is a form of interiorized political violence, which is now found within economic relations themselves. This despotic residue, to call it such, is visible in the abstract personality of capital itself, a drive to calculate and abstract the object of production from itself, and in this way constitute the subject as a politically viable order in competition to others. From this presence of political violence, the centrality of the capitalist state can be deduced, namely the fact that this interiorization of surplus of political violence in the form of law and the realization of the person of property is its central task. However, the process through which political violence becomes interiorized is not straightforward, because compulsion is at the same time a sign of inability of this abstraction taking hold or a sign of resistance. The application of the law becomes central in capitalism. This compulsion can't be isolated from the new regime of needs. It emerges on the basis of a system where needs are in a permanent process of transformation. In other words, a human being in capitalism lacks not only a social system which would furnish it with established ways of satisfying needs, but also a system which does not offer a pre-established set of needs. They are integrated into economic reproduction, which is constantly transforming. The result of this is that the emergence and transformation of needs, as well as necessity to satisfy them, AI establish rights based upon them, make political conflict internal to the state. Conflict does not emerge only when a set of established needs is incapable of being reproduced. It is not a conflict between the state and an external economic sphere, but a permanent political conflict within the state itself. The capitalist state does not have the privilege of the pre-capitalist state to preside over a system of needs that are, in comparison to capitalism, found in a relatively cyclical form of reproduction. Instead, because the state is installed at the root of the system of needs, as a result of which these needs become released, the state becomes a permanently conflicting formation. As such, it is not the law that is presupposed as a self-sufficient and external element, where an act against the law would be a passing contingent occurrence, and when the law is then corrected and contingency expunged. Conflict is not external to the law. Instead, one presupposes conflict, which makes the law always a necessity of being remade, or alternatively, a law which has a built-in tendency toward conflict and self-abolishment. Because of this, the establishment of the law, irregardless of the political instance which is lawmaking, necessitates the state, because this application of the law is its true production. The enforcement of the law, which results in its interiorization to the point where even breaking the law, for example theft, is predicated on its effectivity, is necessitated by the permanent failure of interiorization. In other words, the state does not simply protect private persons from each other, but through this, the principle of private personality. In this way, for example, it does not only protect from theft, it also protects theft as a category of transgression of the law. Without this primary protection, long-term economic relations, even if they could be distilled from their political conditions, would derail because conflict would expand, either through further democratization, violent conflict, and so on, depending on other circumstances. Therefore, what this production of the law results in is a perpetuation of the law, which in itself presupposes the emergence of needs, and as such, the integration of political capacity for organization with the economic process. It perpetuates the conflict in the form of class struggle. As a result, one can conclude that the synthetic relationship of economic relations on the one hand and political capacity for organization on the other, or class struggle, is predicated on the state, because the law is not external to economy, but permanently reproduced within a conflict which is realized in the form of a state. If the synthesis of economy and politics is the precondition for the emergence of non-state political forms, then their emergence should also presuppose the state. The question now was, in what way do the non-state political forms influence the state itself? This question still relates to this idea of production of needs, because the core of the argument that the nation-state lost its central position in capitalism is that the production of needs has reached the point where it has displaced the class struggle itself. In other words, the difference between the released production of needs on the one hand and the inability to satisfy them on the other has broken the confines of the law within which the relation of capital was found. The multitude appears as a form of heterogeneity which does not relate to a previous totality established in the state. For example, the poor and the dispossessed mass of non-citizens appear that have been outstripped of their old social relations and modes of reproduction of needs and have been forcefully integrated into the capitalist system of needs. On the other hand, the production of needs through effective and communicative labor begins to exceed the condition of the law, ai private property, placing it into direct collision with the common. This appearance of the multitude forces capital to become displaced as well as decentralize itself by instituting a dissolved network of political power. This is achieved in Harte and Negri by control or direct appropriation of political power by capital. Control functions through debt relation. Debt appears as the form in which the law or the pre-existing and achieved framework of class relations is suspended. Its essence is the law without the form of law. In other words, the capacity of law to take on its despotic form and impose obligations by curtailing rights. Capital as debt maneuvers around conflict not by suspension of the law from the position of state sovereign, but from a decentralized position beyond the state. The subjection of the state to capital suspends the law, and in fact, by doing this, capital shows itself the true sovereign. Through this, the state becomes reduced to external regulatory functions. It imposes the law, protects it, and so on. It plays a part in a network of power that is decentralized. However, as I have argued, this weakening of sovereignty does not equal the loss of central place state has in the political constitution of capitalism. The reason for this is that the synthetic relationship of economy and politics, which is presupposed in the imposition of debt, is itself predicated on the state, because the state is the form in which this relation of debt as a relation of capital is realized. Furthermore, if the application of the law is in effect its production, another important element of state power emerges here, because debt in essence reveals the surplus of political violence which is immanent to it. In other words, it is the capacity for political organization beyond democratic channels. The chief task of the state in realizing this relation is to convert this excess of political violence back into economic compulsion. In other words, it is essential to make debt a purely economic and as such, in capitalist view, democratic, just category. This is achieved through the simultaneous suppression and expansion of the conflict within the state itself. Now, as mentioned, because this state does not exhaust political capacity for organization in itself, it is not inherently opposed to conflict as such. In fact, through conflict, it appears itself an object of interest. In other words, because it serves as the form through which needs are represented in interest, the state itself becomes a need, and a common need. Because of this transition from a disciplined society, or one organized through institutions, into a society of control, where these institutions become dissolved, you are driven toward the state. You have no other options. As a result of this, the surplus of political violence, which has receded into economic compulsion, reemerges when the proliferation of needs both beyond and within the state reach a critical point. In other words, this privatized, individualized, but also democratic and egalitarian anxiety, where allegedly no surplus of political violence is present, reemerges. But when it reemerges, it takes on a very specific form. Under the model of the market, where fear is not the result of exclusion of one group of people by political coercion, where no excess of political violence is permitted, a democratization of fear takes place, through which the surplus of political violence reemerges in a democratic form. Through this reemergence in a democratic form, it in effect loses its character of an excess of political violence and becomes again legitimized. In other words, through the excess of political capacity for organization beyond the state, through debt, the state is capable of mobilizing the excesses of this capacity, ai democracy, against democratization of conflict itself. In this way, the state suppresses the expansion of conflict by suppressing its democratization, and at the same time, it expands the conflict by releasing it in form of an excess of political violence. But it does this through the model of economic compulsion itself, a common egalitarian fear. Through this quasi-democratic form, this illegitimate surplus of political violence, this despotic residue, becomes again legitimized. So debt, which is a form of capital as a source of this, becomes interiorized into compulsion precisely by letting it, so to say, spill over, but spill over in the form of a democratic exclusion. Think, for example, on the differentiation between the economic and political migrant, where this very act of political violence through which this distinction is constituted at the same time has a form of legitimacy precisely by referring to the undemocratic character of political violence, i.e. such violence that allegedly only political migrants suffer. As a result of all this, the channels of struggle which would have hampered the imposition of the law become suspended, and tendencies of democratization which follow from the struggle rerouted into the confines of the relation of capital. So the conflict is internal to the law and has a tendency to forcefully democratize and decentralize the state. The capitalist state, through an excess of political capacity beyond itself, is equipped with mechanisms of preventing conflict from leaving its boundaries. As a result, the multitude, the heterogeneity which appears from within the capitalist system of needs, becomes recomposed under the empty form of the nation-state. In other words, homogenization in the relation of capital as such. To conclude, this excess of political capacity, which is the precondition for any emancipatory project as well, is not inherently opposed to the centrality of the state. In fact, it is predicated on it and can serve to perpetuate it. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you basically for offering me and giving me the status of professor, which is always nice. I mean, there is a proper professor sitting here close to me, and I'm basically not a professor, but a senior researcher and lecturer. And this reminds me of a time before I finished my PhD, where the people were automatically, as I live in Austria and have been living in Austria for more than 20 years, and Austria is, as you know, prone to giving the titles to all the people around, and then they were giving me the title of doctor even before I managed to start writing my PhD. So basically the proposal, so this is the first part of my lecture, will be to give all possible titles to all people when they are born, and then as they just climb up the hierarchical academic world, then just cut the titles, and then when you end up being nothing, then you are a proper person. So I'm just trying to warm up, even if outside it's quite warm. So I will not read my presentation, and I'll try to keep it a bit simpler. And that might lead to an impression that this is not as precise as it should be, which is probably the case. Then the second preliminary thought before I start, and I'm using the term reflections. I'm going to reflect a little bit on the triangle between democracy, authoritarianism, and capitalism, using some examples from Southeastern Europe, from the region where we are basically living. And by using reflections, I'm going to free myself from the need to provide empirical evidence, which is proper, to construct correlations. So this is going to be more of illustrations and some arguments that are then open for debate. There are different narratives about the relationship between democracy, capitalism, and the way how authoritarianism is playing into the equation. And one of the possible narratives will be the following. The notion of democracy on a global level is challenged first of all, by the narrative of the democracy fatigue. There is this story about, is there a crisis of democracy? Is there another crisis of democracy? Wolfgang has just recently edited a book about crisis of democracy, trying to provide empirical evidence that there is basically not really a crisis of democracy, but a kind of fatigue. And this is one part of the story. The second part of the story is that the authoritarianism, this is the narrative, the authoritarianism is flourishing. So when we look on China, when we look at Russia, when we look at illiberal democracy spreading around Europe, Turkey, Hungary, and so on, we could get an impression that new authoritarianism, whatever the new authoritarianism is, and I'll come to it a bit later, is flourishing and is gaining ground. And this new authoritarianism, this is one of the assumptions, which is gaining ground, is basically presenting itself as the new normalcy. as it is able to incorporate elements of democratic procedures, formal democratic institutions, and as it is able to apply the rhetoric of democracy, which has become one of the core elements of some new authoritarian regimes. So there is a kind of democratic mimicry within the new authoritarian regimes. And in both cases, in this shaken democracy, without going deeper into the debate whether democracy is still endangered or not, and in new authoritarian regimes, there is obviously the argument that capitalism has become an integral part of both of them. This is the global raison d'etre, and this is basically ruining, from my point of view, the classical assumption that basically the liberal assumption that there is exclusive complementarity between democracy and capitalism, which is not the case. Capitalism, as Ignatieff and many, many others are arguing, capitalism is showing his promiscuous face. It's a kind of a lived promiscuity, and capitalism lies in bed with both authoritarianism and democracy. And so here is if this is one of the possible narratives, as we could go on for hours and for days arguing about it, but the question that I'm trying to put into the core of my presentation is basically what is going on in the regimes in between. And the regimes in between, and this is where I see Southeastern Europe, this is where I see the countries of the former Yugoslavia, this is where I see some kind of a periphery belt between the full-fledged authoritarian regimes, China, probably Russia, and the liberal European Union. So my question is basically what are the contradictions, what are the phenomena, what are the new tensions here in this belt in between, in the societies in between, which are not, have not entered the sphere of end of history and full democracies, and which are not fully authoritarian on the other hand side. And by doing so, and by putting a focus on this in between, I'm a little bit trying to avoid the debate about how to define democracy and authoritarianism, which is one of the arguments provided by many, many people, probably Ivan Krastev, who is telling us basically that it is not important to label a regime. It is important actually to look nowadays, in the 21st century, at the regimes in between, which are having a kind of a mixture of elements of democracy, of authoritarianism, and which are presenting themselves as the new normalcy, so to say. So, why are, from my point of view, the gray zone regimes important, and why do I focus on Southeast Europe? The assumption here is that our region is basically contrary to the 90s, or probably to the 2000s, years in 2000, that basically the end of the transition towards democracy is nowadays in 2015 not any close, as it seemed to be, for example, in Serbia in 2000 when Džihić took over and Milošević fell apart, the Milošević system fell apart, or in Croatia as 1999 Tudjman was replaced by the Social Democrats and entering the heaven as the new home, or in Bosnia following the Dayton Peace Agreement, or in Macedonia, whatsoever. So the point is here that there is nowadays no clear end point in sight, and there is a kind of a mixture between a little bit of democratic elements, a little bit of authoritarian rules and values, a little bit of market economy at the same time, state control economy, a little bit of capitalist wilderness and socialist legacy, a little bit of everything. And so I do believe that looking at this little bit of everything is probably a good exercise in getting to know a little bit more about the both democracy, authoritarianism, and capitalism. So why is our region a region in between once again? And the argument here is that our region, the region of Southeastern Europe, starting from looking at the last 40 or 50 years, has seen a kind of a triple disillusionment with democracy. So the first disillusionment with democracy, which is leading to this state in between, was basically the socialist promise of Tito democracy. Democracy based on people's self-management, on limited but still promised participation in the society, and this one failed as the socialist system at the end of the 80s failed. The second promise was the promise of nationalist democracy. At the beginning of the 90s, people popping up and telling us basically that the national sovereignty is the core of our societies. We have to reinvent our nations, our nationhood, and nationness, and then we will be able to enter the era of free nations. And basically we all do know that the nationalist implementation of democracy, or the second nationalist promise of democracy at the beginning of the 90s, ended up in wars and in the complete dissolution of the societies. And then the third promise was the promise of, or the transitional promise of democracy. Basically, there is a role model, this is the European Union. This is the liberal destiny. This is the destiny where we will have, I mean, everything that liberal democracies are supposed to have. And the transition is going to bring us a shiny and bright democratic future. And this is my argument, that basically this third promise of democracy has so far, and I don't see it in the next few years, is not delivering. That even the transitional promise of democracy is basically ending up in the years we are living in a kind of a disillusionment. So we see in the region, once again, no linearity. There is no linear way to democracy, no normative end goal in sight in 2015, despite the fact that we have been transitioning towards this goal for 25 years almost. We see that democratization and de-democratization, as Charles Tilly puts it, that they simply go hand in hand, that regression of democracy and some progress in democratic terms, they simply go hand in hand. And we see that there is basically, if there is a linearity, there is a linearity in implementation of capitalist principles. Privatization, deregulation, Serbia is going to privatize probably the next few companies, Bosnia is doing the same. We have shopping centers as the symbols of consumerism. This is flourishing. I just yesterday had to, as it was raining in Belgrade, bring my small daughter to the shopping center Džihić, just enjoying this consumerism with no spending of money, basically, but, you know. And this is basically where I do see basically that the principles of capitalism are still in place and still in bed with both some democratic and authoritarian principles that we have here. So what we basically need in order to analyze the regimes in between, and particularly Southeastern Europe, we need some kind of new vocabulary. And we need some kind of new raster for analyzing it. Because all the terms that we have been using in the last 10, 15, 20 years of defective democracies, hybrid democracies, illiberal democracies, competitive authoritarianism, new authoritarianism, electorate democracy, whatsoever, are, at least from my point of view, not perfectly describing the picture. Even though I'm not going to offer an alternative, I'm just trying in the next, and this is going to be the two additional parts before I conclude, two possible ways or avenues how to approach this kind of in-between, and both ways that I'm going to describe here are basically in close relationship to capitalism and its supremacy in our region that I still see here. So the first one is the way of describing the phenomenon which Alain Badiou used when he was speaking about the so-called capitalo-parliamentarism. I mean, I don't know whether this is the perfect translation from French, but basically capitalist parliamentarism. And here the assumption is, and that might be quite interesting for our region, is basically that this kind of capitalo-parliamentarism is the best modus vivendi in Southeastern Europe, or from his point of view generally, to combine basically the profit-oriented interests of new political economic elites and with the popular consent that is needed in a regime. So 2 points by Alain Badiou that are quite interesting here for our region. The first one is basically that the parliamentarism is not only a kind of a subjective or institutional figure, but also a kind of a unique kind of political subjectivity that we have in the region, where the political engagement, which is important for democracies, is here reduced to just a propagandistic level, or propagandistic label, to be more precise. What does it mean? It basically means that the parliaments, and this is why capital parliamentarism is able to exist and at the same time to to get the popular consent. There are parliaments, but the parliaments are facades or emptied from critical thinking, from negotiations, from confronting each other positions, and they are simply arenas of politicians, of managers, of new elites, which are controlled or dominated by the parties. So basically the fact that, and this is one of the empirical evidences here, the fact that the parliaments in former Yugoslavia, look at the parliament in Bosnia, look at the parliament in Serbia, look at the parliament in Croatia, in Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, they don't have anything to say. So this is basically, you have the parliamentary institutional facade, and nobody, I mean, ask Vučić if he is listening to the guys discussing in the parliament. Basically not relevant at all. And the emptied parliaments are one part of this capitalo parliamentarism. And the second part is basically that there is uncontested autonomy of the capital, of the people that are having the capital, and of the market. That means capital, the owners, and the market are not questionable at all. And when you just put the two elements together, you get this capital of parliamentarism, which might be one interesting way or one interesting glasses that we could put on in order to look at Southeastern Europe and to see actually what the dynamics behind it are. So the second way, leaving Badiou a bit aside and coming to John Keane, and you know, I mean, there is this thick book. I mean, thick books are quite important because you can kill your wife if, or your your wife can kill you in a postmodern term if you are attending the conferences and not taking care of your child. But what John Keane is suggesting. He's basically, I mean, recently he was at the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, spent a lot of time there, but he is also proposing a kind of a new vocabulary, and he proposes basically the term despotism as the new term to describe what's the new authoritarianism or the new kind of regime that we have in place nowadays. And what, when you, what I'm just going to try to do next is to have like 7 points, and this is then going to be a kind of a Keynes framework applied on Southeastern Europe, that basically the despotism is a new vocabulary, a new way of thinking about the triangle between democracy, authoritarianism, and capitalism is something that is probably, when it comes to Southeastern Europe and when it comes to this triangle, having a kind of a more explanatory weight than all the other terms. So what are the basic elements of Keane applied in Southeastern Europe? And all of them are basically having this capitalist mode of functioning in its core. The first one is the patron-client system. So basically the despotic regimes, and my argument is here that in Southeastern Europe, what we are seeing nowadays are new despotisms in place. And they have following features, and I'm just going to provide some illustrations for it. The first one is the patron-client form of organization of society. So you have the fact basically that goods, services, or especially money are exchanged for political support. This is a kind of a power arrangement that you have on a broader level. So you have some goods, services, money, posts in the administration, jobs in the parties whatsoever, and you distribute them in order to create a kind of client-patron dependency, and having that one, you can basically establish and fortify your rule. A lot of examples. Djordje in time of Senada was probably the best possible way of doing so, even though Senada ended up in jail. But Gruevski in Macedonia nowadays, with his VMRO Depemene, is probably one of the quite nice examples how this patron-client system is basically ruining the democracy and the notion of democracy completely. You have something similar with the PDK, the party of Hashim Tači in Kosovo, where basically one part of the society is regulated by this patron-client system, and then the another one is ruled by the LDK, and then the third one by the Ramush Haradinaj AAK, and you have a kind of a perfect setup for this patron-client relationship. So this is the first one. The second one is the plutocracy, as Keen is describing it. So basically what we have in the region, when we just apply it to the region, we have the rule of the wealthy, the rule of the new rich, and the new rich are basically the winners of the transitional period of the last 25 years. So that means the plutocracy is a rule where the new winners of transition are able to control the losers of transition. I mean, this is basically where we see the corrupted elites or the symbiosis between the political and economic elites in place, and where basically, and this is quite important, the inequality is taken as granted. So this is a kind of a system where you simply accept or nourish the inequalities within the society in order to strengthen your rule. But then the second question, if we are speaking about plutocracy, if this is right, then the question is, how do they gain legitimation? There is this model by Merkel Gershevsky, which is quite nice, diffuse and specific support. That means within the plutocracy, you need to gain, and you have to gain some support, some popular support. You can do it by providing some output through this patron-client assistance, which is in terms of wealth for the selected few. Or you can go the way to use this diffuse way of legitimation, which is basically using the rhetorics of nation, religious communities, of the enemy that is out there rallying around the flag, whatsoever. And then if you deploy these rhetorics, basically, and this is the rhetorics of Kosovo, of Srebrenica, victimization, veterans in Croatia, whatsoever, this is basically then the tool that you are using in order to keep this rule and your power ongoing. And I have to speed up because I just have 20 minutes. It's 2, okay. Forgot my glasses. So the third one is the Keynes concept of middle classes. So the Keynes assumption is basically that the new despotism, or that the most stable despotisms are those that enjoy the support of the middle class. As we cannot speak about the classical middle class in Southeastern Europe, we can speak about the transitiologist new middle class, which encompasses parts of civil society, parts of academia, parts of new businessmen, and higher administration. And what is interesting here, that basically this middle class is either politically disinterested or politically promiscuous. That means they change between Dačić and Vučić, and Vučić and Tadić, and whatsoever. It's completely the same. And here there is an interesting notion explaining a little bit more of this middle classes as a part of the regime, of the rule. Going back to Tocqueville, he basically described this part of class, and this is perfectly fitting in Southeastern Europe, as the class constantly, quoting Tocqueville, constantly circling for petty pleasures, a stratum of the so-called citizens willing to embrace an immense protective power that treats its subjects as perpetual children, as a flock of timid animals in need of a shepherd. So this is just a kind of going a bit deeper into the middle classes and the explanation of what the middle classes are. Then, if I can take 2 more minutes, the fourth element are the periodic elections. So basically the elections are an integral part of this new despotism, and this is basically a desire by the elites and by political representatives to get a kind of a fetish that is approving their rule. So you need the permanent elections to gain legitimacy in the eyes of people whom you dominate. And this is as if you take I mean, the notion of elections as useful instruments of despotism, you could perfectly apply Vučić's desire to go to election once again, just in order to get, as big support by the population as possible in order to rule the country by himself. Then the fifth, and this is I'm going to skip the fifth as we don't have time, but the fifth is the notion of the sovereign people, where you have a lot of kind of a rhetoric of democracy, where the politicians and political elites are constantly focusing on the narrative that the people are those who are actually important for us. When Gruevski nowadays is Begović, Vučić, or whom else is appearing before the media, they are constantly speaking about people, people, people. We need to address the people, the needs of the people, and so on. And that goes so far that, for example, following the protests in Bosnia in 2014 in February, the politicians were appearing before the cameras blaming the politicians for the protests. I mean, I'm a politician, I'm saying, oh, the terrible politicians, look at them, we need to dismiss them, and I am the politicians themselves. So this is the first. Then the sixth, and then there is only a small seven, and then I'm going to conclude. The sixth is the permanent campaign. So what the new despotism, and I see it in Southeastern Europe quite on a widespread notion, is the permanent campaign, where you permanently are in a kind of a PR a campaign to explain yourself, to appear before the cameras, to control the media, and to convince basically the people that you are successful, that you are delivering. And then you have a lot of symbolical politics here. Take the example of Vučić and the floods, or Vučić and Novi Sad and the snowstorm, where he is then carrying the baby and then trying to portray himself as a savior. And then finally, there is this seventh element. This is the economy of repression. The regimes that are here in place are ready to deploy either soft or direct kinds of repressions, which are features of new authoritarianism, basically, as seen in protests in Bosnia and following the protests, as seen probably partly as in protests in Macedonia, and as probably seen on a daily level in Kosovo, and so on and so on. So this is the seven elements, just a kind of a try to portray, following Keane, portray the triangle between capitalism, democracy, and authoritarianism. So basically, to conclude, in 2015, the question is basically what are the ways out. One is the radical thinking, which is not heard by the people in Ušće, and the one possible tool to get out of this dilemma is basically the radicalization by social protests, creating a kind of a commonness and togetherness. Or the second one is simply to accept that there is a permanent present as the ultimate and resilient form, and this permanent present is a part of the present where we are all part of it, basically confirming it by criticizing it as the permanent present is much more powerful than we are. So, thank you, Rastko, for offering me 4.5 more minutes, and sorry for not being as precise as my forespeaker.
Thank you, Vedran.
I would like to thank the Institute for this opportunity and for inviting me to this conference. I see this actually as the opportunity to reflect on some of these concepts I'm currently working on. And just to inform you, I have just begun researching these subjects. And a lot of things are not going to be clear. They're not yet clear to me. So I'll use this conference to clarify a little bit these concepts also to myself. Hopefully with some of your help. So whenever I do this presentation, something like this, I reflect on Hamlet, my favorite literature, and I usually reflect on that the time is out of joint sentence, but now I'm going to reflect on that most famous to be or not to be sentence, and I'll try and answer this dilemma later in my presentation, and what I think that global capitalism in this context how would it answer this problematic dilemma. So for first, we need to clarify what I'm going to talk about. Maybe you didn't see, but the title of my presentation is Crossing Class Borders or Crossing Borders, but the B in borders is in brackets. So that would be something like crossing class borders or orders. So we are going to talk about borders and policies. And, you know, just to keep it simple, we need to just vaguely define these concepts. So basically, border is a line that actually defines and encircles some sort of space, whether it be social or whether it be physical space. We don't have the time to reflect much on it. About the policies, we need to also reflect something about the policies. It seems that we said yesterday that there is this crisis of utopia, and there is a lack of utopia in political projects. So a large part of political projects we see in everyday life, and we see as a part of politics, is actually composed of these policy approaches. So these policy approaches are actually, in a very large extent, actually attempts to say solve some of the problems of the capitalism and solve some of its foundational contradictions. So as they are actually attempts to solve some of the foundational contradictions, all of these policies are actually ambiguous in their foundations. So, for example, some 35 years ago, you had a problem of very high wages. So you come up with a solution, and high wages and high cost of production. So you come up with a set of policies, I don't know, destroying unions, destroying labor movement, moving production to China. So there, you got it, problem solved. But this ambiguity makes a problem later on, because some 20 or 30 years ago, some 20 or 30 years after you apply these policies, you have another problem coming out from this policy you applied maybe 20 years before it. So you have another set of problems. You think about another set of policies to solve those newly problems, and you just go on and go on. I think that it was Engels that said that capitalism actually is not capable of solving its problems, only moving them around. What we see in this example is actually this temporal movement of problem. You just temporarily move problems some 30 years in advance, and then when those 30 years are gone, you just sort of physically or temporarily move those newly problems again on some other time or space. So basically what we are going to speak about, and what I'm thinking about and what I'm reflecting on, is actually using borders or borders being used by policies in order to solve or dampen some of the contradictions and problems that are emerging from contemporary capitalism. So we actually all know that there are policies being created in order to manipulate borders. For example, we all know that the process of globalization is marked by this attempt to dissolve borders for capital. Capital by itself is very mobile. I think that it was Marx that said that it goes through a certain life cycle, and when it goes into this stage of money, when capital becomes money, it is as if it is in the stage of butterfly. It can just flap its wings and go wherever it wants. So ambiguity in this policy of dissolving borders for capital is actually in these masses of impoverished populations that are actually following capital and moving from the impoverished periphery of the world or continent or maybe a country or a region, and just trying to move themselves after the capital. They have this awkward, tendency of, wanting to make their life better, and sort of closeness to the center of capital is actually one of the strategies of existence. So that is the problem. So you sit down and think of another set of policies about borders. Actually, you're trying to do a totally different stuff. You're trying to make borders solid enough so they don't let people move around in such a free way. So, well, because you can't just close down the borders, you actually need to think of something more subtle. And what is more subtle about current policies? I'm best, I know the policies of European Union vaguely. Is sort of make them shift them around spatially and or discursively. So when we are talking about spatial shifting of borders, it's actually quite easy. For example, we have this high flux of people moving from Northern Africa, moving via Mediterranean to Southern Europe, to Malta, Lampedusa, Italy, and so on. So what was the solution? You made a policy. European Union is going to make some sort of overlapping space of jurisdiction on the coastline of North Africa, where militarized agencies of European Union, some sort of coast guards or whatever they're going to call it, are going to have some jurisdiction of searching and destroying the vessels that are transporting people from North Africa to Europe. On the other hand, here in Serbia, on the northern frontier, on the frontier with Hungary, we have German police officers, border police officers, helping Serbian police office in controlling the migration from Serbia to Hungary. So since the migrants from Syria that are trying this land route to Europe aren't going to stay in Hungary, they are going to move to Austria and then eventually to Germany. The policy of Germany was actually to shift its border a little bit south on the border of Serbia. So it's quite simple about this spatial shifting of borders. But now we come to this discursive shifting of borders, and things get a little bit complicated. And this actually happens in parallel while we move from this macro level of continent and controlling migrations and people moving around on the level of continent when we go to nation states. So nation states in Europe have this tendency. It's actually not yet really, you don't have a solid document that you can pinpoint and say that this is the document that is this or this policy. So, but there is this tendency to make gaining citizenship more and more difficult. So this policy actually reflects this foundationally ambiguous relationship of capital towards labor, where capital considers labor both necessary but also dangerous on the political level. So what is the policy? The policy is actually to allow people to stay in Germany as a cheap labor force, as a very precarious labor force, because when you don't have a citizenship, you actually have a much more difficult time when trying to defend your working rights, say, or any kind of civil rights, or gaining social security or health insurance. So this policy was actually answering this question of Hamlet's question from the beginning. I think that global capitalism in this current situation would answer it. It is best to both be here and not to be here spatially as a precarious labor force, and not to be there politically, because when you don't allow someone to have citizenship, then you actually deprive him of his political and civil rights. So when you move down to a lower level, to say a region or maybe city regions, this was inevitable. Public transportation So there's this new border, there's this new policy that is trying to convert public transportation from the mechanism of movement, from the mechanism of mobility of populations, into a mechanism of control of movement of population. For example, I always reflect on the example of Belgrade. I'm not from Belgrade, I'm from Obrenovac. I have to do a daily commute for some 30 kilometers. So when you charge public transportation certain price, there is going to be left some part of the population that is not going to be able to pay for that daily commute or for that transportation and that mobility. So what you effectively do is actually make this public transportation, you transform it into a semiconductive membrane or semi-selective membrane that actually selects or charges even. You could say that even it charges this entry fee to the center of Belgrade or of any kind of capital. So when you go to even lower level, on a totally micro level say urban environments, urbanized environments such as center of Belgrade, then you have this another set of policies that is actually trying to invent new kinds of borders and police them around with newly invented agencies of those borders. And the strategy in controlling these inner urban class borders is actually inventing urban order. So I always reflect, and this is one of the key things in all this presentation, is broken window theory. If anyone doesn't know what broken window theory is, okay. Broken window theory is this sort of advice invented in the beginning of the 1980s on how to best control the urban order. And the advice was to thoroughly and effectively fix any signs of cracks, scratches, or twists in material or social fabric of urban environments. So broken window, if you see a broken window on a building, people are going to think that, you know, we can break all the windows and in a matter of weeks you're going to have this large decay of urban environment. So the policy is actually to react quickly to those banal and small elements of disorder or what is perceived as disorder. Well, since you are delegating certain power, police force and communal police, as agencies of this urban order, what you get is actually them reflecting and projecting the state power directly into the socially marginalized. Because when you say your target is the smallest possible twist or scratch, you are inevitably going to have this power projected directly to the socially marginalized populations. This is one thing that you receive. The other thing that you receive from these kinds of policies is actually the possibility of using public service, such as police or communal police, as a mean of controlling class relationship in urban orders. In urban landscapes and in urban environments. Actually, what I have as this really important dilemma is actually this sort of negative fascination with the capitalism. So when you see these policies, they sort of just flow from that organization of capitalism and organization of global capitalism. And all of them seem both affectious and logic and, you know, something to be also expected. So this is something like not a conclusion, but a question. I'm asking you a question now. If anyone can reflect on this, so I will be very, very grateful. Did I overdo the time?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, not by much, right?
No,
okay.
It's okay. Okay, thank you, Stefan.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, and thank you because you're here. I will try to be short and simple as much as this is humanly possible. Well, I will begin with an example that is accessible to all of us, and it was repeated again and again in the classrooms for learning Hegelian dialectics. Of course, this is famous part of phenomenology of spirit, when Hegel is explicating master-slave dialectics. I will not try to summarize what is said there, nor to give some special interpretation of it, since this is well known. And the starting point for my example will be a remote phase of Hegel's narrative about master and slave, the culminating point of the whole story where the master ceases to be what he is and when his truth, which is captured in slavery, is coming to the light. We should assert that at the high point of master-slave relationship, master is something close to an atrophied body or a body without extremities, totally incapable and dependent, since he placed the slave as a mediator between him and the things of external world. He is fed, kept, etc. In short, his activity is pure enjoyment in negating products made by slave. He eventually, suffering the lack of any positive activity, is reduced to the one hungry mouth and nothing more. For all the time, the slave, in a direct relationship with the external world, is forced to form himself and to advance his skills in manipulating this external world in order to provide for his master. Well, essentially, this is Hegel's idea of Bildung. All of this development leads to the situation of utterly backward and incapable master on the one side, and extremely proficient and able slave on the other. And here comes the dialectical resolution in which the slave is not going to become the master, but he becomes completely self-conscious self, or to speak in more comprehensive terms, the modern citizen, the brand new bourgeois, able to practice his freedom in the civil society with its institutions, where he will recognize others as equals. Not to further this explication, as I promised that I am not going to retell Hegel's story. I would just like to mark 2 points of exceptional importance. First, it is easy to see in the Hegelian master-slave dialectic a clash between ancient regimes of 18th and early 19th century Europe, and up to that time, remarkably strengthened bourgeois class, which pledged to form a system of governance sufficient to serve its needs, and this is, of course, a modern state, which Hegel sees as only institutional frame, wide enough and complete to serve as medium through which modern citizens could actualize their newly gained freedoms. So it will not be a mistake to say that in the dialectic of master and slave, we could detect antagonism between ancient regime and modern state, characteristic for Hegel's writings, such as writing on the affairs of Württemberg and German constitution from as one of the Hegel's early writings. This is first important point to mark. Also, with it one banal but important remark is necessary. A state is possible on the grounds of this dialectic, insofar as it is modern state. Second point to mark is obvious, but maybe even more important than the first. It is master in the master-slave dialectic is shown as somebody whose activity is purely negative, so pure enjoyment and leisure. He is not doing anything to really assure his position. He is not placing himself in an active relationship with the slave, and thus he is simply made unnecessary with the growth of slaves' Bildung. Now, I would like to transpose this schema to the Marxist mode of thinking, in a sense of Marxist orthodoxy. And in advance, I am apologizing for necessary simplifications that eventually could occur. From this point of view, Hegel's story is quite a good example for explanation of transition from the feudalism to the bourgeois society. But it could not, in its current version, satisfy possible transition from the capitalism to the different mode of production. However, this lack of explanatory potential could be increased with a little correction on the picture of a master, which is now by no means a purely negative hedonist. He becomes truly active, but his activity, now is directed in the investment in the means of his sustenance as a master, most important of which is state, of course. So, here we have, on the one side, a master who is exercising his control and investing himself in the strengthening of the mechanisms of it, and on the other side, we have a kind of a slave, proletarian, who works for the sustenance of his master, providing him even with the means for furthering his ways of control, and also for himself, where he works purely to reproduce himself. So the resolution of such a situation seems a bit more difficult, but then there is a classical answer. No matter how hard the bourgeois class is pushing to strengthen means for the securing of the productive relations, it will not be enough to overpower the development of the means of production. So in the end, revolution will be inevitable, and again, dialectic will be resolved. In the end, there will be no room left for any state. Similarly, as in Hegelian dialectics, any need for masters will cease to exist. Here, we have two situations, a classic Hegelian one and the traditional Marxist version of this same example. There is room for one more variety. What if there is a possibility that the master is more versatile than we suppose? What if his positive activity towards the preservation of his power is not just uniform exercise, but it is mutable activity, and what if to the changes in the productive forces, he could respond with equal change in the way he is using his mechanisms of control? What if state is mutating, step by step, with the proletariat? We all know too well Marx's dictum from the manifesto that what the bourgeois therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers, accompanied with his assertion that no epoch before capitalistic one produced such a dynamic changes in productive forces, that could simply be understood that inherent tendency of capitalism towards more efficient means for extraction of value from the labor process leads inevitably towards the rapid changes and developments in the very process of production, up to the extent that current relations of production could not sustain such change. And this we could assume is correct. But what if the bourgeois are not just successful as the generators for the development of productive forces, but are equally good at developing mechanisms of surveillance, control, and repression? Might it be that those mechanisms, as functions of state apparatus, are evolving rapidly as the needs of capital are changing? This tendency we could today even assert as a fact. This is not a revolutionary assertion. Already the members of the Frankfurt School came to this conclusion in analyzing of the relationships between state and capital during the 30s, which resulted in more or less great extent of resignation. But this fact, mutability of the state in the capitalistic society, is not to be dismissed, and especially today, we could see its effect in the phenomenon that I would like to call a politics of state, which I will use for all the political practices which are not using the state conventionally, and it is as a repository of force which could be utilized to actualize any goal or interest of social and economic groups, but as an ideological object. Here we could recognize a reversion of classical scheme of a state that is producing ideologies, and we could rather speak about state as a product of ideologies, or to leave aside that word with its traditional burdensome meaning, as a product of some sort of pre-political discourses which are taking the place, so to speak, before the state and after the state, but which are surpassing state as an instrument in a classical sense. I will explain it further, but now I would like to halt for a bit and consider the genesis and nature of bourgeois state briefly, since it is necessary and as feasible as it is for a duration of a couple of minutes. I will follow Ernst Mendel here and say that we could identify the beginning of a modern bourgeois state with the battle cry of no taxation without representation. Originally, this slogan is dating from 1750s and is ascribed to the American colonists presenting their requests of representation in the British Parliament. Of course, British parliamentarism is something with a longer history. But anyway, this battle cry summarizes ratio for the establishment of a bourgeois state. It is fairly simple, since the main body of taxpayers got comprised of big and middle capital owners. They simply wanted their share in the spending of that money, so they wanted their interests represented and considered on the part of the state, just to become co-ruler of the king and the feudal elite. This was only the first step in the transformation of the state into the instrument in the service of the bourgeoisie, and all the further steps of the parliamentarism are not changing much of this basis. that the modern state is essentially a state of dominant social class that emerged in modernity as bourgeoisie. Of course, someone could here employ the standard complaint that the rights of ordinary people have developed and that universal suffrage, for example, was only a consequent step that were developed from the representative principles of a bourgeois state. But it is not a very hard task to show that any such a gain was always accompanied with equal loss. For example, universal suffrage was sometimes countered with universal equal taxation, even for the poor who could not sustain it, which even contributed to the widespread poverty, etc. And most importantly, all of these developments were applied in such a manner not to touch the foundation of a modern state, and this is representing of a bourgeois interests. So perfect symbiosis between the state as an instrument and the bourgeois class as the one who provides funds for its functioning was not endangered in single instance. Any chance of real incorporation of a will of all the members of society were countered on the structural level. One of the most sacred ideals of the bourgeois state is its structure, and an overly celebrated strict distinction between legislative and executive power. Structure of the instruments of executive power is persistent, and most importantly, completely hierarchical. So on the highest position of this hierarchy, there is greater chance that we are going to see people from the upper classes which could afford the necessary education, etc. Also, the simple fact of a great gap between the wages inside this hierarchy is utilized this way that it reproduces class divisions from the bourgeois society inside the apparatus of bourgeois state. So we could assert that pushed from the below, bourgeois state is constantly changing itself, strengthening executive power, and making legislative power almost symbolical. There is also pressure of a structure of capital itself, as Mendel remarks. During the 19th century, even up to the First World War, representative legislative function in the parliament was an effective way for the settlement of some issues of bourgeois, since the interests were much more individualized and the stake of monopolies and big concerns was not as important. As the structure of capital changed, power was moved to the lobbies and interest groups. It is interesting to mention an example of Zonrattel during the early 30s and his position in MWT, which provided him with a valuable insight from the center of real decision-making in Germany of that time. And we also could see that the alliance with the centralistic state was not only an option for which they were lobbying these years. At this point, when the link between big capital and fixed structures of administrative system and the instruments of executive were definitively established, necessary condition for the thing that I mentioned as a politics of state was formed. First of all, there we have almost two states. First state is comprised by the interests of a big capital, strong apparatuses of executive power, and legislative completely dependent and incapable of any serious action. And the other one, which is living just as a slim idea about people's representation during universal suffrage inside the legislative power. There, precisely one new object is formed, a state that could be used as an object in the discourses mainly designed to legitimize interests of various privileged socio-economical groups. Since there is a lack of time, I guess, I will try to give how much I know?
More, 10 minutes more, I think so.
Perfect.
8 minutes more.
I will try to give here a kind of a clumsy example, and I'm not sure that it will completely fit the purpose, but there is no other way than to try. So I will use example of contemporary Greece. We all know too well tried public ratio for the legitimacy of Greek debt. Greece is a state with a system of legislative representation, so the debt that was made by the Greek government is debt of a Greek state and accordingly of a Greek people. And it stands if the legislative power with the universal suffrage is a true source of power for the contemporary functioning of the state. But what if this is not so? I am not here able to give further examples. But from the very structure of the contemporary capital-state relationship, we could have make a strong suspicions about the direct role of Greek people in the indebting of their country. But this could not prevent ideological usage of a concept of a Greek state as a dumping yard for a debt, which is anyway de facto made by elected officials, but placed inside a very tight atmosphere between big capital interests, banks, and not the less structure of administration and the instruments of executive power as the guardian of this whole system. If you are speaking about Greece, it is interesting to mention military expenditures of this country, which is direct investment in the pillars of bourgeois state. Even in the times of crisis, Greek expenditures for the army were relatively high, around 2.5% of GDP, all behind the veil of security, legitimated by the arms race with Turkey as a traditional enemy, influx of the refugees, and conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. So the pillars of the system needs to remain intact, and especially in the times of crisis, when the social order could be questioned, they need to be equally reinforced. So the investments in the army and police are important almost as a politics of strict reducing in all other expenditures. If I am not wrong, quite recently Syriza allowed a little reduction in defense expenditures. On the other hand, we are having the opposite ratio that brought Syriza into power, and in its also tried popular form, it could be summarized as follows. Debt of a Greek state, insofar as state is here to represent the interests of a people, could not be a valid debt because it is debt made in the cooperation between big capital, banks, various interest groups, and obviously contrary to the interests of Greek people. There, state is represented as something wrongly understood as dumping yard for all the expenses that are made for the sake of interests that are not the interests of a people that should be represented in the parliament. Then the line of demarcation is made between inert fictive state and the strong and real state, which would be real representative of the interests of people and which could by no means acknowledge the legitimacy of debt. Well, this last option was discarded in real political practice, but we should not underestimate its potential in political struggle. But this move is no less out of the basket of the practices that I marked as the politics of state, but it comes from another direction. First image of the indebted people, guilty because of wrong choices of their representation, could be ascribed to the interests of capital, but other picture of a sovereign people's state that is not guilty for the misdeeds of its predecessors is another picture that after the real representatives are elected and when they come to their offices embedded in the halls of a system is resulting by the harsh reality of a not much promising reprogramming of a Greek debt. For the end, it is interesting to assert the following situation. On the one side, we are having a fiction of a parliamentary democracy which made itself good for the purposes of making scapegoats, and also it is much embedded inside a tight structure of strong executive systems and interests of capital, that it is offering almost useless entry towards power for the eventual revolutionary forces. So we could say that contemporary bourgeoisie, why not use this word, made a perfect illusion of state. That doesn't mean that the essence of bourgeois state, a system of executive power, is not preserved in its entirety. Illusion, which could be used as another instrument of power, state could be now employed not just in its function as an instrument of direct, almost physical force, it, or better its shadow, in the form of a representative system with a functional legislative power, could be strategically used to transpose the debts directed to the people, to impose hostilities between another state if necessary, to legitimate spendings in the instruments of executive power, etc. On the other side, or better as a consequence of such a situation, we are having a politics, and yes, they are coming from the left, that are promoting the sovereign strong state, which could eventually lead to the similarities between left and right politics today. I'm not saying that this response is completely futile. I could not say this, but my opinion is that as long as the linkage between the capital interests and strict administrative structures of bourgeois state with strong instruments of executive power remains intact, and as long as pillars of the state, army, police, non-elective judicature, etc., remains intact, perspectives for the success of any politics labeling itself left could be legitimately brought into question. Thank you.
I will speak about an odd revolution. It is a capitalist revolution called neoliberalism. we can say that neoliberalism is successful capitalist revolution which has introduced new economic and culture patterns and at the same time strengthened the position of the upper class. The upper class which was named as the financial elite by Dimeny Levy and other authors. Why is neoliberalism revolutionary? Neoliberalism has brought a ceaseless transformation of production, of some segments of productions, new waves of technologies and goods, invention of new advertising strategies. Neoliberalism subverts all what is fixed and outmoded. And it is a successful revolution because neoliberalism bolstered the class position of the financial elite. I don't know how Marx made it, but we can find a perfect portrayal of the domination of the financial elite in Marx's work. It is in the work called Class Struggles in France. I allow quote a short passage. This is from the beginning where Marx wrote about the July monarchy in France between 1830 and 1848. Marx says the so-called financial aristocracy sat on the throne, and next, the core, the faction of the bourgeoisie that ruled and legislated through the chambers had a direct interest in the indebtedness of the state. The state deficit was really the main object of its speculation and the chief source of its enrichment. At the end of each year, a new deficit. And the final stroke of his portrayal, the enormous sums which in this way flowed through the hands of the state facilitated, moreover, swindling contracts for deliveries, bribery, defalcations, and all kinds of roguery. To finance aristocracy in its mode of acquisition as well as in its pleasures is nothing but the rebirth of the lumpen proletariat on the heights of bourgeois society. We can use the term coined by a Czech philosopher Karel Kosík, lumpen bourgeoisie. This term conveys the set of or to reality that the financial aristocracy or elite has no or do not acknowledge moral values. It is nothing for them. And we can say that a neoliberal revolution has made lumpen bourgeoisie the ruling class, or lumpen bourgeoisie features the dominating features. We can say something to patterns which was introduced by neoliberalism under the rule of lumpen bourgeoisie. The first pattern is separation, the separation of financial and productive capital. The second feature is flexible mode of accumulation or flexibility. Third pattern is fragmentation and disorganization of the living conditions. Now, we can have a look at the postmodern left. I think that that today's left movement is led by the ideals and patterns coined by postmodern left theoreticians such as Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, or Hart and Negri, or I don't know, we can add Giovanni Vattimo with his recent book called Hermeneutic Communism. And now I can show the patterns coined by postmodern left, which are adequate to the neoliberal pattern. The first pattern, separation of politics and economics, or in other words, separation of theory and praxis. It corresponds to the separation as a pattern of neoliberal capitalism. The separation of politics and economics leads to the disappearing of the notion such as the labor or the economy itself in this stream of theory. There is no such thing as the last instance determination in the postmodern left theory. The second pattern of the postmodern left, the flexibilization of concepts. Laclau and Mouffe and others claim that the concepts such as class, justice, equality, socialism is nothing else than the results of a discursive practices. And these terms have nothing to do with a reality, or there is nothing relation to between these concepts and the social reality. I can mention the term objective thoughts forms, which Alex Demirovich spoke about. The third pattern of the postmodern left is fragmentation and disorganization. And it expresses in the left-wing movement itself, where, for instance, the concept of multitude by Hart and Negri conveys the character of the contemporary left movement. The multitude means that there is no perspective of an unification, that it must be always many and many perspectives which cooperate accidentally. So I claim that postmodern left is belated. All these patterns are targeted at the patterns which were brought by the former stage of capitalism called Fordist Keynesian capitalism. Patterns such as interconnection of the state and financial and productive capital, or the fixed or mechanical structures, or rigidity and regulation. And postmodern left is targeted at exactly this kind of pattern. And therefore, I claim that the postmodern left is belated. So, these patterns, the postmodern patterns, causes that the left, the postmodern left, is not able to conceptualize the domination of the lumpen bourgeoisie, because the lumpen bourgeoisie is one class, and it is not compatible with the paradigm of pluralism. And it is the second consequence. The postmodern left cannot reflect that its patterns and strategies are in some extent determined, or if you like, over-determined by the capitalist revolution. And this is the main span to the restoration of Marxist philosophy. Thank you for your attention.
a discussion now. Please. Is there a mic for him? Yeah. Okay.
The question for Professor Džihić.
Senior researcher.
Doctor or professor. Just a joke. Sorry if I didn't understand correctly, but I would like to hear what are the main features of democracy as a concept, which can be used as criteria for deciding if Balkan or Southeast European countries are democratic or not. If it is, for example, freedom of speech, I think that it is not a sufficient criterion, and I'm not sure that there is a freedom of speech at all in those countries, because this, what is called freedom of speech, is a parody of it, looking at the state capital pressure on media, etc. If the criterion is political decisioning, be it direct or representative, I'm also not sure about the level of democratization of those countries, because it is not democracy but partitocracy with oligarchic elites, and as you said, a kind of political order, which I call partitocracy, rule of the parties, which supports permanently plutocracy, or criminal neoliberal capitalism in Balkan forms. So I'm afraid that all the criteria show that Southeast European countries are not democracies at all. Maybe democratures or democratur, or pseudo-democracies or bastard forms of socio-political order, but the democracies they are not.
So you can answer right now, yeah?
Just quickly, that was precisely my point. The point was basically that there's a kind of in-between state of the art, which is neither democracy nor full authoritarianism nor full-fledged whatsoever. So basically, and when we precisely starting from any kind of definition of democracy, when you just go step by step as you just did, and take, okay, representation is one crucial part of democracy. Representation is disturbed by partitocracy or by empty institutions of representations, be it, for example, parliaments. Then the second one, second criteria might be the check and balances. There is no check and balances simply because the power is concentrated in the hand of few. Then the next one will be the respect for fundamental and human rights, which is basically, when it comes, I mean, we could take LGBT as an extreme example, but many, many examples where the justice or this kind of approach, rule of law, has been turned towards the rule by law, where the ruling power centers are actually basically ruling the country by applying the law, by dominating the justice. And then fourthly, if we take the value, the level of values within the society, we will still see a kind of a traditional patriarchal macho kind of society in the Western Balkans, mixing up with the capitalist premises of consumerism. So basically this was my point. But on the other hand side, when you look and try to say whether this is a kind of full authoritarianism, it is not, because there are still so-called areas of contestation. There are arenas where the rulers can be contested, be it through elections, be it through the critical public opinion, which is partly, let's say, at least in internet, present, at least at the conference like this one here, at least in some parts of civil society, or within the protest movements, like in Bosnia, like in Macedonia, like in Croatia previously, Varšavska Slit, Filozofski. So there are several arenas of contestation which are contesting this nor democracy, neither authoritarianism in between state. And my attempt was basically to try to find different vocabulary to describe this in between by using Alain Badiou or John Keene's term of despotism, which is more precise, looking at phenomena within the society, and explicitly not using the vocabulary of democracy or authoritarianism as simply democracy in our region, and basically, I mean, not only in our region, has become a kind of an empty signifier. I mean, a diffuse term that is used by all with different meanings, and creating a kind of a confusion when using the word democracy. So precisely, I'm completely on your side, but my attempt was just to create a kind of a different approach towards the phenomenon.